Hi everybody. This week we're going to focus on learning to read English. And we're going to do that for two reasons. First, the vast majority of students you encounter are going to be native English speakers whose first reading language is also English. Just like the first language that we learn predisposes us to think about how all languages work, the first language we learn to read in predisposes us to think that reading will function in a certain way. And that's not necessarily the case. So it's very important that you understand how your students learn to read their first language so that you can pre-plan for the issues that they're going to encounter when they try to learn how to read in a second language. The other reason for this particular lesson, this particular week, is that reading methodologies tend to get picked up and transferred from one place to another. Pretty much every reading method that has been used to teach English reading has also been used to teach Hebrew reading, and you'll see that next week in particular. It also means that fads in different language reading, fads in English reading, for example, get picked up and transferred over to Hebrew reading as well. So, for example, programmed reading was a hot fad a number of years ago in English, and lo and behold, programmed reading got picked up and applied to Hebrew as well. Similarly, whole languages, like a hot trend in American classrooms currently, has been for about the last 10 years or so. And similarly, there are whole language Hebrew approaches. The oldest method of teaching reading is known as the alphabet method. And I will say this is the oldest known method. There was reading before there were alphabets. The Egyptian hieroglyphic system, the Chinese logographic system, those predate the invention of the alphabet. We don't know exactly how those systems were taught in ancient times. We don't even really know how the first alphabetic system was taught in ancient times. Contrary to what the Greeks claim, they did not invent the alphabet, and they did not invent reading. That was done the alphabet was invented by Semitic people living in the southern part of Israel and in the Sinai Peninsula thousands of years before Greek writing came into being. But the system that the Greeks used to teach reading became known as the alphabet method, and while I'm skeptical that they invented it, they were certainly the first to document it. I suspect that it was invented, the system was invented by the same people who invented the alphabet, but I can't prove it. There's no documentation for that. So we can only say that the Greeks were the first to document how this was done and that it was used to teach Greek in ancient times. The alphabet method is a letters to sounds method of teaching reading. So the process worked this way. Learners first had to learn the names of the letters. This was done purely orally, without actually associating the letter's name with the actual letter shape. So first they had to learn to recite the alphabet, often done with songs, to this day in English. And then once they learned all the names of the letters and could recite the string in order, they were then taught to associate each letter symbol with its name. Once they had mastered the letter names and associations with the symbols, they were then drilled in all of the possible consonant-vowel and consonant-vowel-consonant syllables in the language, anything that could be read. And they would read these syllables aloud by saying the name of each letter and then saying the word. So they would say C, A, T, cat. Every single consonant, vowel, consonant syllable was drilled that way. They then, then this took a couple of years to master all of this. after they had learned how to make these recitations by saying the names of the letters and then the word or the syllable, they then had to relearn all of the syllables, but had to do so by suppressing the letter names, even though that was the strongest association that had been built up over at least 2 years worth of time. So they first had to learn something, then they had to unlearn it. And finally, after all of this, they were presented with words in the same way. First spelling them with the letter names, and then learning to say the words without the letter spellings. And this took an enormous amount of time. As I said, this was a time-consuming process. It took years to learn how to read an alphabetic language. It was also terrifically boring. And it was inefficient because first they would have to learn everything by saying the letter name and then relearn it without the letter name, having to suppress the initial and strongest association. And the biggest difficulty for beginning readers was progressing from that stage of naming letters to the stage of abstracting the sound for the letter's name, and then blending it with the other sounds derived from other letter names. That was a very big step, and it was one of the places that the system would fall apart. And despite these issues, it remained the predominant method for teaching reading in Europe for centuries. The alphabet method remained the predominant method in Europe until early in the 16th century, starting in Germany. And there a new method developed that focused on the sounds rather than the letter names. We know this method as phonics. It is a sounds to letters approach to reading instruction. So from the beginning, the learner was taught to associate individual letter shapes or clusters of letters, those symbols, with the sounds that they represent. The first proponent of this method was a Bavarian school teacher by the name of Valentin Ichelsamer. Ichelsamer developed an entire systematic approach to teaching reading that focused on the sounds, not the letter names. So what he would do is he would write a word on the board. He would then pronounce the word and ask the students to repeat that pronunciation, that word back. And he would have them repeat it multiple times until he was certain that everybody understood what the word was. He then provided an analysis of each sound symbol association. So he would break the word into its component sounds and show the class how those sounds were represented by the individual letters or letter clusters. In fact, this entire approach focused on sound analysis, on this phonemic analysis, rather than words and what the words meant. Ichelsamer's primer didn't really catch on, but his approach did inspire others to build on what he had started. For example, word cards or letter cards were created, which could be used to analyze words or build them. Each letter card had a sound on it, or a cluster of common letter combinations for the language. And students could take those cards and use them to build words, or they could look at a word and then break it down into its component pieces using the cards for themselves. Another kind of activity that came about was drill patterns that used the onset rhyme pattern. So the initial consonant, the onset, would change, but the rhyme, the rhyming part, the end part of the piece, would remain the same, such as bat, cat, hat, and so on. The drawback with phonics was twofold. One, the overemphasis on sound analysis over word reading was really an issue because, again, it focused ad nauseum on sound analysis. And while that could be really helpful in a language like German, which is highly consistent, highly phonetically consistent, it didn't work so well with English, which lacks consistency. I mean, that is the hallmark of English, is that those clusters of letters do not represent the same sound. We have bow, do, enough, through, and so on. All those OUGH letters, for example, just simply don't map consistently onto a single sound. In answer to the problems of phonics, the Germans developed another method, which became known as the normal word method. This was a word to phonics approach to reading. It was developed in Germany, and it emphasized meaningful words over the sound symbol associations, but it also involved phonemic analysis and a controlled approach to instruction. So, for example, a handful of letters and vowels, a handful of consonants and vowels were taught. And the ones that were taught in the first lesson were designed to produce the maximum number of words. And the words themselves that were introduced especially early on were everyday words, things that kids already knew. They already knew what the word meant. So you didn't have to focus so much on meaning. You could focus on the sound and how the sound conveyed the meaning. And they were consistent in manner and highly recognizable to the reader. And that allowed for the use of those onset rhyme drills without having to do endless amounts of phonemic analysis. New letters would then be gradually introduced to build on prior knowledge. It was very structured and very scaffolded, so that each new thing introduced could be applied easily to everything that had gone before it. The American educator Horace Mann went to Germany. He went on a tour, and he saw this method being used to teach reading in Germany, and he endorsed it. He brought it back and endorsed its use in American schools. Unfortunately, when it transferred from Germany to America, the word method underwent some significant changes. First, American teachers were really obsessed with the need to teach spelling. This is because English spelling is such a difficult skill to master, so teachers would take every opportunity that they could to reinforce how words were spelled, including substituting the letter names for the letter sounds. So what they managed to do was morph the normal word method back to the alphabet method. Second issue was that the Gestalt psychologists had noted that whole words could be processed as quickly as single letters. This was the finding of James M. Cattell, the American psychologist. And so the normal word method from Germany morphed into the whole word method in America. In whole word method, students are asked to recognize words as individual entities, whole entities. In contrast to the normal word method, where students are asked to abstract the sounds from the words, in the whole word method, students are asked to memorize on sight between 100 and 200 words before they even are exposed to any discussion about sound-symbol relationships. This emphasis on sight words has often led to the approach being called the look and say method, or the look and say approach. And it was the primary method of reading instruction for most of the 20th century. It still remains, even into the 21st century, a very prominent method. The reason for whole words ascendancy is that it had the support of two of the leading thinkers in American education. John Dewey, the leading proponent of progressive education, endorsed the whole word method, as did Edward Thorndike, the father of educational psychology. For Thorndike, the whole word method fit very neatly into his scheme of how learning should be conducted altogether. Thorndike developed a number of laws regarding education and learning. One was the law of readiness. This states that learning should be carefully sequenced from familiar to unfamiliar, with very strict limits on how much new material is introduced at any given time. So when Thorndike wrote his pre-primer, his first grade pre-primer, the first book contained only 8 words. The second contained 5 more, so that within just under the first half of first grade, students only learned to read 13 words. But they learned to read those 13 words in part because of the law of exercise. According to Thorndike, words need to be repeated between 16 and 29 times before the reader will have mastered them to the point of automaticity. That's the ability to read it automatically, and that is, of course, the goal of the whole word method. And it also conformed to his law of identical items, so that new items were added very, very, very slowly, with no more than 1 new item or new word for every 7 or 8 total. Many of us learn to read English using the Dick and Jane or the Sally Dick and Jane series, which conforms exactly to Thorndike's laws and was also the product of William Gray, who we learned about last week. This is a classic example of Dick and Jane, and as the little cartoon a couple of slides ago suggests, there's not much happening in this story. The 1950s brought about the first major volley in what has come to be known as the Reading Wars. In 1959, an author by the name of Rudolf Flesch published a book called Why Johnny Can't Read. This book was aimed at parents, and it was a book that supported entirely the approach of teaching reading through phonics. And it attacked the whole word method and teachers in general, reading teachers in general. The second thing that happened only 2 years later was the launch of Sputnik 1. This was a major shock for America. It wasn't a shock for the leadership of the country. Eisenhower was not surprised that it happened. He knew from his intelligence services that the Russians were building this rocket. And in fact, Eisenhower was actually pleased that the Soviets were the first to be launching something into space, because it was such an unknown issue. You know, nobody knew how this was going to turn out. Nobody knew if it was going to work. Nobody knew what would happen with a rocket going up. But the American public had a totally different reaction. They were not happy that the Soviets were first in space. That struck at American pride in a way that Eisenhower and most of the leadership certainly weren't prepared for. And possibly as a result of the success of Flesch's book, which spent weeks and weeks and weeks as #1 on the bestseller list, partly because of that, there were charges leveled against the schools that somehow schools were to blame for the failure of our scientists to be able to be first in space, especially in the areas of math and science. Those teachers took a pretty big beating in the press, but reading teachers were also faulted because there was an accusation that American graduates of the schools couldn't understand the scientific literature. As a result of Sputnik, A year later, in 1958, Congress passed the National Defense Education Act, which provided a lot of funding to the schools for curriculum development and retraining teachers. And that led to the behaviorists jumping into the issue of reading. Now, Thorndike himself was really much more of a behaviorist in terms of psychology than he was a Gestalt psychologist. And so here again, the reading materials that the behaviorists developed really fell in line with Thorndike's thinking about how things should be sequenced and structured. So in the 60s, we get the DISTAR reading program. DISTAR stands for Direct Instructional Systems for Teaching and Remediation. There was DISTAR Math and DISTAR Reading and various other workbooks. There also was this push among the psychologists to make materials teacher-proof. That is one of those things that just I think of this and I get a little aggravated. It goes to the notion that the common belief that teachers weren't really competent professionals, and so shouldn't be treated like competent professionals, but just functionaries who, anybody could do this job, which of course we know is completely not true. You can't make materials teacher-proof because you have to have a teacher who can solve problems on the ground when they encounter them. The other thing that these methods were designed to do is to provide immediate feedback. So there were skills being taught systematically with immediate feedback. And the big material producer that did that was SRA, the SRA Reading Laboratory, which some of you may have suffered through in elementary school as well. By the end of the 60s, the question was, which method is best, whole word or phonics? And to try to solve that question, there was a set of 27 large-scale studies of first-grade classrooms. In all, more than 200 first-grade classrooms were involved in these various studies. They would have a treatment group which used a phonics or code emphasis program, and a control group which used whole word or a meaning emphasis program. And all of these studies came to the same conclusion. Code emphasis produced superior results to the meaning emphasis programs. And also several of the studies noted that there was a need to focus on training teachers who can offer differentiated instruction based on whatever arises in the learning situation. All of these studies were done, they were all government funded, they were huge, and they were completely ignored. At the same time, Jean Chall, who was an incredible reading researcher, she published a book in 1967 called Learning to Read: The Great Debate. Chall reviewed all of the research on reading from the 1930s all the way through the 1960s. She visited more than 300 classrooms in the US and Britain. It took her 3 years to complete her study and write her book, but her finding confirmed what had been found in the first grade studies as well, and that is early decoding using a code-based approach, namely phonics, produced better word recognition and spelling, but also facilitated reading comprehension. In other words, the meaning-based approaches didn't facilitate better reading comprehension, even though meaning was supposed to be the focus of whole word. At the same time, a completely different TAC grew out of the linguistics faculties. This was a time when Noam Chomsky's model of first language acquisition was taking hold and really transforming how we think about linguistics and how we think about language acquisition. And linguists began to speculate that reading acquisition would work the same way that language acquisition worked. Supporting this idea were a number of studies that were done on reading failures in the inner cities. And all of those studies pointed out that impoverished language skills were the primary cause of reading failure for students who were in minority groups, who were in immigrant families where English was not spoken at home, and in general for students from lower socioeconomic groups. Ken Goodman, who was at the University of Arizona, he theorized that all a learner needs to learn to read is exposure to print, in the same way that all a language speaker needs to learn to speak a language is exposure to the spoken language. Goodman claimed that the reader would deduce the meaning of unknown words from context, just as young children do with spoken language. They figure out the word that they don't know the meaning of based on the context in which it's spoken. And Goodman coined a phrase. He referred to reading as a psycholinguistic guessing game. This is the foundation of what we know today as the whole language approach. In whole language, which proponents will tell you is not a method, it is a philosophy. It addressed the cause to make reading instruction more engaging by providing children with lots of vocabulary building and ways of finding personal meaning in the text, and especially in being able to express their own thoughts in writing. Direct instruction in phonics, word attack skills, or comprehension, if any direct instruction was provided at all, it was required that it grow organically from the student's encounter with texts and that it only be directed at fostering comprehension. For proponents of whole language, motivation is paramount. The idea is to get kids excited about literature and get them wanting to read, and that there was a philosophy that if they wanted to learn how to read, it would happen. They used trade books, really good children's literature, rather than basal readers. Basal readers tend to structure this from simple to complex and take readers along a progression of predetermined skill building, where trade books are all over the place. The language of trade books is not controlled. Students were also really encouraged to write, but there was no emphasis placed on correct spelling. Rather, they referred to what students did was invented spelling, as you can see from the illustration. With decades of whole word and whole language in play, we can see the following results from the research. 20% of students nationwide have trouble reading. 20%. For minority and lower socioeconomic students, reading failure rates are between 60 and 70%. That's really untenable. But at the same time, it's not just a matter of poverty or minority status or being an immigrant. A third of poor readers in America are from college-educated families. So what this tells us is that we need to better prepare teachers so that they know what the research is, and that we need teacher programs that will focus on those skills that teachers need, those skills and that information. And contrary to what Goodman held, learning to read really is not natural and easy. As you saw last week, reading is a cultural artifact. It's not something that is inherent. We're not born with the ability to read. We are born with the ability to acquire a spoken language, but reading is a cultural artifact. It's something that you have to learn to do. And Louisa Moats, who has been advocating for better teacher preparation, she has pointed out that teaching reading really is the job for an expert. Her article, Teaching Reading is Rocket Science, I've posted in this week's class shell. It is an absolute must read. It is more important to read this article this week than it is to read anything in the chapters from the textbook, in part because Moats makes everything very, very, very clear about some of the pitfalls in teaching English reading. And as you read her article, think especially in terms of how this information might be applied to Hebrew reading. In other words, it's going to be different. Hebrew is a different language. It works differently from English. But what kinds of things that she recommends you know would be helpful for you to know about Hebrew, just as she says they're important to know them about English. So, in summary, the reading wars have produced opposing sides, two opposing sides with two opposing views. On one side, we have proponents of code-based instruction. This would be phonics. To a certain degree, this would be the normal word method. It's also known as a bottom-up approach, which means you take the smallest units of the language as a starting point, letters to phonemes, phonemes to syllables, syllables to words, words to phrases, and so on to reach comprehension. And the focus is on the sound-symbol relationships. On the other side, we have meaning-based instruction. The reader in this approach, the reader generates meaning by having background knowledge, by having expectations of how the story is going to go, making assumptions, asking questions, and so on, and reads to confirm those expectations. This kind of approach will use pre-reading activities that activate schema, which are the notions of expectations of how this is going to be. It'll include reviewing, predicting, providing background information, and so on. It may tell you about the author's experiences. It may tell you where the author lived and when. It may tell you background information about the place where the story occurs, or about the kinds of people that it describes. But it doesn't focus on things like the letters and the sounds that they represent. And finally, there is a push, really the current push is toward a dual path approach. In other words, this approach uses both bottom-up and top-down strategies, either simultaneously or alternating back and forth between one and the other, all of which are aimed to help the reader understand the text. The research, again, favors a bottom-up approach in the earliest stages, followed by a top-down approach as readers develop competence. And it may explain why there is that dual neurological pathway that shows up when a word is read. You saw that in the video clip from last week, where they slowed the brain scan down by a factor of 200 so that you could see the electrical impulse as it moved from the occipital lobe up into the temporal lobe. And it split as it went, with part of it going to that area of the occipital lobe that analyzes sounds, and the other part going to that part of the occipital lobe that analyzes the word meaning. This may explain that dual pathway that develops during word reading. In any case, learning to read is one of the most difficult things that anyone can accomplish. It's astonishing that we can read in one language. It gets even more astonishing that we can learn how to read in two. And next week, you'll get a chance to see just how incredibly difficult Hebrew reading can be as well.